All right. Hey there, folks. Since book tour and conventions are still somewhat on hold, I figured I'd bring book tour to you. So welcome to Russ's Rockin' Rollercoaster Season 5, intriguing interviews with creative minds. As we did last year, with Halloween upon us, I figured we should get a little dark and creepy. So welcome to Spooky Stories 2, where we'll be digging into ghouls and ghosts and other terrifying creatures that go bump in the night. Now, with us tonight, and I want to preface this a little bit to everyone who's on the panel and at home, with us tonight is my old friend, Daniel Braum. We go back a very long way. We haven't actually been in the same room together in 30-something years, so that shows how good friends we really are. Just kidding. We used to hang out back in the day, so it's great to have you back. Dan is the author of multiple short story collections, a novella, and an upcoming novel. His work in horror has appeared in publications including Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet, the Shivers 8 Anthology, and the Best Horror of the Year, Volume 12. He is also the host of Nighttime Logic series and the annual New York Ghost Story Festival. Welcome, Dan.
Hey, thanks so much, Russ. Great to see you. I think over those 30 years, we bumped into each other at a convention or so, and maybe at a couple of mutual friends' barbecues. But my memory isn't what it used to be, so I won't hold.
Wait, did we? If I recall, we met at Mid Ohio. Was that Mid Ohio Con?
Like I think it was years ago. All Press Expo. Like we bumped into.
Oh, maybe that's what it was.
I remember it quite. It was really exciting bumping into you in the hallowed halls of back when people used to walk around unmasked and shop for comic books together.
Absolutely, yeah, good stuff. All right. Also on our panel is Gwendolyn Kiste. Did I say that right?
Kiste.
Sorry. See, I did it wrong anyway. Sorry. The Bram Stoker award-winning author of The Rust Maidens, Bone Set and Feathers, and Her Smile Will Untether the Universe, Pretty Marys All in a Row, and The Invention of Ghosts. Her short fiction and nonfiction have appeared in Nightmare Magazine, Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy, Visterion, Tours Nightfire, The Dark, and Daily Science Fiction, among others. Hello, Gwendolyn.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
All right. And finally, welcome Sarah Reed, a Bram Stoker award-winning author of dark fiction. Her short stories can be found in various publications, including Ellen Datlow's Best Horror of the Years, Volumes 10 and 12, and Out of Water, and her debut novel, The Bone Weaver's Orchard. Welcome, Sarah.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
All right. Just a heads up for the folks at home. Feel free to send me notes or questions that you have for me or the panel in the chat box during the show, and we'll get to a few at the end. All right, so let's jump in. All right, so first of all, before we get started, of course, we have to do a little of this. Are you feeling it? Are you feeling this? Is that coming up on the volume?
No.
I just had to do that once. And actually, though, before we do get started, I have to admit, I had a little bit of a medical emergency this week before the show started. I had an accident with a weed whacker, and this happened, but I'm okay. I'm all good now. The surgery was a success. I'm back to normal.
I totally believed you for a second. I totally thought, oh no, there's some kind of emergency.
I was out there on Elm Street doing my thing, and me and Freddy Krueger had a little bit of a dalliance, and that's how things go. All right. Just a little prop.
I'm glad the regrowth serum worked for you.
There you go. All right. Okay, so we're going to dive in right from the beginning. So I want to be fully transparent. I'm not a horror guy. I don't read it. I don't watch it. It scares the crap out of me. I am a big baby. I have nightmares. I can't do it. But I am absolutely and utterly fascinated by horror fans. I love actually horror conventions. I love them. Just because it's so great just to be around it, but I can't get in. I can't let it seep into my mindset, or it's bad news for me. I'll be chattering under my covers until 5 a.m. So let me ask you this. Why do we love, or more to the point, why do you love having the holy bejesus scared out of you? Why do you like to be scared? So I'll start with Sarah.
Well, I think part of it for me is that it doesn't scare me. It's at least not in the way that I see it scare other people. Like if I'm watching a horror movie with someone who gets scared, I have more fun watching them than the movie. But I don't feel fear. Instead, it's this curiosity, I guess. Kind of an existential curiosity almost. It's thrilling. I want to know more when I see something scary. I want to know the whole story. So I don't get that sense of fear so much. I mean, I definitely can build a sense of dread. And, when I was a kid, I remember not wanting to, hang my feet over the edge of the couch while I was watching a scary movie. But it's never quite affected me the way that I enjoy watching it affect other people.
Well, because I'm exactly I remember this is going back, I don't know, let's call it 25 years, maybe more than that. I had Pet Sematary on the TV. And it was one of those deals where I could watch for 10 minutes. I'd have to switch the channel. It was my way of sort of watching like through my fingers. And even that gave me nightmares when the kid crawls out from under the bed and he slices the Achilles heel of whoever it was. I'm out. That's it. Goodbye. I'm done. I can't do it. So Dan, what about you?
I'm really glad you asked that question, and I think you have the perfect panel with Gwendolyn and Sarah and myself here for that. I have a confession too. I'm just like you, Russ. I don't like to be scared. I don't like the gore. I don't like to be uncomfortable, and that's why I think I learned something. I'm a relative newcomer to the world of horror. In addition, I think horror is such a wonderfully wide umbrella of a genre that it also allows for the kind of fiction that isn't about the scares, the fears, and the dread necessarily, but it has something of a flip side to that, which is something I call, or I learned to call, there's also a sense of wonder and a sense of awe going on right next door to all that awful stuff. And also, so you say, well, why do I watch that stuff? The kind of stuff that I watch or that I read, or that really captures my excitement as both a reader and a writer, is the kind of things where it's less about the monster or the scare, but the scare itself is a catalyst to a human story or a human condition. And that's the stuff that both really interests me and ultimately will really upset me.
Gwendolyn, what about you?
I think somebody just kind of stole my answer in the comments. Like, I think real life is scary, and I think just everyday living is scary, and watching the news is scary. And so for me, horror is never going to be as scary as the things we're just dealing with in real life, just what's going on in the world, just aging, getting older, knowing that death is coming no matter what we do. So it's like, to me, like, horror at least gives me a neat story. Like it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. As opposed to real life, which can be very chaotic. Not only is it scary, but you don't know where it's going. You don't know what's going to happen. Whereas a movie kind of puts it, or a story puts it into a place that it's like, okay, now it's going to follow some trajectory, as opposed to real life, which can feel so random. So I do feel like I'm with Sarah on this, that I don't usually get super afraid of horror. It doesn't usually scare me because I'm usually so afraid of just real life that horror actually seems like less terrifying to me than like everything out there, out in the world.
Oh, so. God, you got to give me some of that bravery serum, because I don't have it. All right, so let me ask you this. So Gwen, let's stick with you. So what got you hooked on horror to begin with?
Both my parents are horror fans, so I always grew up with it. I think that's another reason why it's very comforting to me, because it was like, hey, we're going to watch a horror movie. And that's from the time I was really little. It was like we would have pizza and we would watch a horror movie. And my dad's always been into Universal monster movies. His dad got him into it. So my grandfather got him into it. Then he got me into it. And it'd be like Saturday afternoon and we'd be watching a Hammer movie or something like that. It was just so comforting and so much fun. And I think especially like Universal horror and Hammer movies are a little less maybe scary. Like they're not as gory usually, especially some of the early Hammer movies as some of like slashers. So it was like, it felt like something, I'm like, yeah, I can watch this. This isn't like R-rated or anything. So I was allowed to always watch it. And yeah, it was just fun. It was just, I always remember those weekends of just spending the whole weekend watching horror movies or watching Twilight Zone episodes. It feels like, feels like childhood.
Yeah, Sarah, what about you?
Kind of similarly, it was my grandmother. She really introduced me to a lot of like, even spooky picture books before I could even read, like glow in the dark haunted house, anything, some Alvin Schwartz, stuff that you could get out of the Scholastic book order that looked spooky. She'd read those to me at bedtime. And then it was, Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights and things like that. And then she always would buy me whatever horror book was at the grocery checkout. Like, it was on the list. It was part of the grocery list every week. So, whatever Dean Koontz or Anne Rice novel was there at the checkout, I was coming home with me. And she'd sit and read Anne Rule, and I would sit and read Anne Rice. And this was like, the early 90s, so nobody cared what I was reading. So yeah, I don't remember a time when I wasn't interested in it. My parents would let me watch whatever. They didn't care. Or if they did care, they'd watch the made for TV version first, and then they'd get it from Blockbuster for me. So it'd be the theatrical version. So like, I saw The Exorcist before I was 10, like it was an early indoctrination to these things.
Good Lord.
And I loved it.
And I remember seeing The Exorcist. I was in my 20s, maybe. And I'm still traumatized by it.
I think I was 7.
Maybe that's it. Maybe I needed to be traumatized earlier, so I'd have sort of like calluses on my soul, so it won't penetrate the same way. Happened. So Dan, what about you? So you said you were kind of a late bloomer into horror. What kind of got you into it?
Well, I think I was a late bloomer, perhaps into the amazing horror writing that's happening now. But my story is just like Gwendolyn's and Sarah's. I mean, Saturday afternoon TV, kaiju movies, monster movies, and was also so fortunate enough that my mom did bring home books from that. We missed those mass market paperbacks at the checkouts. I remember getting a copy of The Stand brought home to me, like, oh, it's a fat book, read it. Like, all right. So
actually, let me ask you about that. So you said The Stand, and I do this once in a while. So right here is The Stand, and I keep this on my shelf because this is one of my all-time favorite books.
Oh yeah.
I refer to it from time to time when I need inspiration. But let me ask you something. While there are certainly horrific elements within it, do you consider The Stand horror, really? Because it didn't feel, I don't know, sort of, that's going to kind of lead into my next question, is that, horror is such a broad term, right? You've got ghosts, demons, slashers, psychological horror, body horror, survival horror, environmental horror, so anyone who wants to answer, what's your favorite kind of horror? Or is it just sort of yes to all?
I mean, I'll jump in on that. Like, there's so many different quote unquote kinds of horror, but it's, I guess, one of those things I learned as a late bloomer is how that horror is that genre that it helps that it plays nicely and is perhaps found next door to, works well with all the other kinds of genres or kinds of fiction. So so is The Stand horror? Yes, unless you think it isn't. I know that's a bit of a simplistic answer, but that's one of the things that I find so wonderful about the horror. My favorite is, I like the quiet horror. I like the horror that doesn't have the gore, that doesn't have perhaps the killers. Ones that are more like Gwendolyn mentioned, like the old Twilight Zones, that are more about the tension between the supernatural and the psychological would be my favorite.
It's actually interesting. So years ago, maybe, I don't know, let's call it 10, 15 years ago, I was at Thriller Fest in Manhattan, and through someone that I knew, they brought me, I actually got into the convention for free, and I got to sit in on a panel with David Morrell, who wrote First Blood, right? The Rambo bit.
Got it.
And I wound up getting to hang out with him for a bit afterwards. And he said, the things, the stories where, the whatever jumps out and goes boo. He's like, it's a cheap thrill. He said, but when you're telling a story about someone comes home from work and their neighbor comes by to greet them, who they've known every day, but their neighbor turns out to be this terrible person who's going to do something horrible to them, and you welcome them into your home because you don't realize that person is this other person. Now that's horrifying, right? Because it completely shatters. You have a sense of safety and comfort and familiarity, but you actually have no idea what's right behind, it's all surface. But you don't realize what's right in front of you the whole time. And as the audience member, you tend to sort of learn about the threat before the character does. So you're in fear for them. You're not in fear for you, you're in fear for them. Right? Is that an element of kind of what you're into?
Me?
Yeah, I would say,
go please.
Like they say a lot that horror is rooted in empathy. So yeah, it's your fear for the characters that's kind of driving your anxiety. And yeah, I think that's what I think appeals to a lot of horror fans, is that sense of empathy. Definitely is for me.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I do think that I think some of it also comes from the fact that we're hoping that people care about us, right, as human beings. So it makes it so you want to care about other people. It's this thing of like trying to like build a community. And I think horror is a lot about that. Is, as much as a lot of movies, they do have somebody die in them, a lot of horror, not all horror necessarily. That doesn't necessarily happen, but it often does. But, it is this desire to see somebody, get out of something or get out of the house. You always want to yell that in certain movies where, like you said, that somebody's in the house, like, get out of the house, get out of the room, get out of that place. Like you want that to happen because you kind of want somebody to be hopefully yelling that at you if you're ever in that situation.
I remember, I don't know if you ever saw it. This was the first movie that Spielberg did. It was a TV movie called The Duel, right, in the 70s, right? Do you know this one? Mm-hmm. Right. So it's about this trucker just starts hunting down this poor guy for, an hour and a half. And we never know why. Never. They never tell us what the deal is. I'm just being hunted down by this. There's a person who we never see inside this ominous vehicle hunting me down with no explanation relentlessly. And that's it. That's the whole story. You know what? Like, if you're going to hate me, tell me why you hate me. But to have someone come at you and you don't even know why, it's sort of the unknown, it's still horrible. You're still coming after me. Mm-hmm. But it's like, if I don't know why, it's 1,000 times worse, right? It's that unknown of that sort of that, I don't know, maybe a sense of, you tell me, a sense of, when you don't know, you really have no, well, control is a funny thing, but you don't have a sense of control. Mm-hmm. Right. I don't know how to put this into context.
Yeah, you can't fix it if you don't know why.
Right. I can't even label it. I don't even know what it is. Okay, so I have to ask this. What the holy fuck is the deal with clowns? To me, there is no such thing as a good clown. Even the nice ones are creepy as shit. So talk to me. What's your take on clowns?
I feel like clowns, like you said, have always been scary for as long as I can remember. I do think Stephen King definitely played up on it, but I think it was scary even before that. That's why he kind of used it. So I am curious if there was a point in pop culture, like in the cultural consciousness, where clowns were just exciting and happy and positive. I don't know. I have to assume they were at one point, but I don't know. Like, I can't really, I guess maybe when circuses were more popular. And so like those were kind of more ubiquitous, that like they would come to towns and it wouldn't seem so scary. Maybe, I don't know. Like, they've always seemed scary to me though. I definitely agree with that.
Anyone have any clown thoughts? No, we're all good.
I've never been able to get the clown thing. Like they always seem kind of ridiculous to me. Like, I can't take them seriously. So I also can't take them seriously as an antagonist. So like, I've never been able to enjoy it because it was like, it's just a clown.
I always think back of that one Simpsons episode where Bart is traumatized by the clown. And he has the nightmares and he goes, can't sleep, clown will eat me, can't sleep, the clown will eat me. To me, that's all what clowns are. The only thing they can do is horrify me. There's no such thing as a good clown. Okay, so I also want to talk about, and this is sort of a long-standing one, but there's a layer to this, and this is what really interests me. I want to talk about vampires. Now, yes, there's the physicality to it all, right? I want to suck your blood, I've drained your body, you're an undead, and they do. But to me, and this is what I want to get into with you guys, there are all, into my mind anyway, there are all kinds of vampires, particularly regular, ordinary people who live ordinary lives, but they have the kind of personality where they kind of sort of suck the life out of you spiritually, emotionally, and psychologically, because they got their own shit going on and they probably don't even think of themselves that way. But these people have this way of sort of seducing you or trying to seduce you into their misery. So
Russ, are you talking about Colin Ferguson, the energy vampire from What We Do in the Shadows? Really, yeah.
The Colin Robinson.
Colin Robinson.
Come on, talk to me about, vampires and the psychology behind vampires. I'm curious about this.
Well, for me, I think just that sense of immortality, you've got two sides of the immortality coin. We have the fear of death. So there's this possibility that you could become immortal, but then there's also the sense that just the dread of being unchangeable in that immortality. I think there's two sides to that dread there, where, what would you really do if you live forever? Like that's gonna kill your soul after a while.
Wasn't there? There was a Twilight Zone episode about that very thing, right? There was like a gangster or something, and he was able to live forever. And then at the beginning, it's like, woohoo, right? And he kind of lived it up. He had a hotel suite and gambling. He always won. And after a while, he's like, this sucks. All of this is fake. None of it's real. There's no risk. And he was utterly miserable.
Yeah, I think immortality.
Anne Rice played with it a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, I think immortality would be terrible for that reason. Yeah, I think it would be so scary. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Sarah. If you have more, go.
I was just saying Anne Rice played with that a lot, and Neil Gaiman did too in his Sandman comics. But I think it's just this sense of, oh, we don't want to die, let's become immortal. And then you're immortal and you're like, fuck, what have I done?
Well, I mean, if you live forever and you dare to get close to anyone, you're going to see a lot. You're going to see literally every person you ever meet will die.
Yeah.
Right in front of your eyes. You just keep on going.
Yeah.
That's a lot to carry, I would think.
Yeah. And this is something I talked about in another panel recently, also just the financial aspects of immortality, of having to always make money forever and ever. You can never retire if you're immortal. Like, it's like you're going to have to keep working and working and working, or figuring out some kind of revenue stream. Maybe that's why they're always like derelict castles, right? Because Dracula's like, I can't work a 9 to 5
That's the upkeep.
Yeah.
I can't make the mortgage payments.
Yeah, it's too much. It's way too much. That terrifies me so much about oh God, we'll go on and on with immortality, and then it's like I have to keep working forever. And you can't even say I'm gonna work till I die. You're just gonna have to work forever.
Right. I want to go back just a little bit, because you had mentioned it. Again, I know enough about the gist of the story, and I had sort of I've mentioned this over the years a few times when I've been out on book tours and conventions. So I think on the surface anyway, one of the laziest, easiest plot lines to introduce is putting a child in real peril and doing something really diabolical to a child, right? Because they're defenseless, they have that sense of innocence, and whether it's molestation or any sort of abuse. Now, on the surface, it's sort of it's kind of a cheap way to kind of drag in a reader, just because you think it creates instant empathy. Oh my God, the poor kid, how could you do this to him? But it feels to me on the surface very manipulative, because it is so horrifying. What about tales where, look, terrible things really do happen to children, and it's every day, and it is legitimately horrible. And I'm not suggesting that tales involving the abuse of children aren't valid, but to me, there seems to be there's a very fine line between telling kind of a legitimate organic story based around, real trauma, and just sort of trying to get a cheap hook. I don't have a good idea. Oh, I know, I'll go torture a kid and then I can build around that, because it's on the surface, it's very easy. Dan, where do you fall on this?
Well, I'm lucky I've never come across that. It does sound pretty, it sounds pretty cheap to me, quite frankly. Sounds pretty uninteresting to me, quite frankly. And yeah, just not interested in tales of abuse, and also, yeah, just not interested in sort of superficial stuff like that.
I mean, like a story like not round, like Sleepers, right? I mean, that wasn't. I mean, that was a really. I don't know if you're familiar with
Is that
it.
a Dean Koontz story?
It was a crime story, right? You know, these three kids in Hell's Kitchen where they got sent to juvie or jail, or jail when they were like 12 years old or something, and then they got abused by the prison guards, and then when they come out later, they kind of go back for revenge. And this is based on a true story, and so some of these things are legitimate. But I remember.
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess I'd be more interested, right, if it's putting it out there. Right, if it's putting it out there for perhaps right, it's a hard whatever, a difficult balancing act. But if it's putting it out there for some sort of a sense of empowerment, I might be more interested in it. Yeah, I know. I guess revenge horror is something that's out there that yeah, without really judging it, it doesn't seem to really be one of the kinds of horror that just never really caught my interest.
Yeah, I think
any kind of horror can be. Go ahead, Gwen.
I know we keep talking over each other. How does this keep happening?
So, all right, I'll make it easy. Gwendolyn.
Okay. I think so many things are just how it's done, like
Mhm.
it can be done well, but I agree. And I think almost any kind of storytelling can be manipulative. And anytime it starts, whether it's a topic like this or anytime, like, I'm okay going into story. Obviously, to some extent, that the there's gonna be a give and take, because that's what storytelling is. But when I start feeling like I'm being manipulated, whatever the topic is, I start feeling kind of like irritated, like, oh, you're just doing this to try to elicit a response without having to do the work of being a storyteller, of actually having to build,
Yes.
the characters and do this. So
Exactly.
I do get irritated when that kind of stuff. And I do think that anything with children, with women, especially with sexual assault, that often is like, oh, we're going to do this because it's salacious and it'll get people upset. And it's like, all of these topics are valid when they're dealt with in a way that isn't manipulative or exploitive. But once it starts getting into manipulation and exploitation, I'm like, I'm out. I don't have any interest in that. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Sarah?
Yeah, that's pretty much what I was going to say, is
Okay.
any trope in horror can be exploitative if it's not done well. And I think what's key for creators is just to keep in mind that empathy is earned. Like, you have to earn that reader's empathy and compose a story in which you make that emotional connection and you're not just exploiting the reader or the viewer's emotions.
All right, so I agree. So here's kind of it's a nuanced question, but I think it's kind of really goes, at least to my mind anyway, it goes to the heart of really kind of where horror, where maybe some other genres end and horror begins. So in your mind, what's the difference between let's say a thriller and suspense, and then like, so let's say, like, you're on the curve, right? It's like, fun, adventurous, exciting, a little scary, thriller, suspense, horror. What's that? What tips us into the red zone that puts us into horror rather than like suspense or thriller? What's that? What's the dividing line there? Sarah?
Well, I'm a librarian, so this is the eternal question, right? Like, how do you classify things? Where do you shelve them in the building? And I think that you're like very rarely going to get a firm consensus. If you have however many people you have in the room, you may have that many opinions. So it's tricky. And I ran into trouble with that on my own book too. Is it a mystery? Is it horror? Does it have enough horror elements to make it horror instead of mystery? And I would argue yes. And I've had people tell me my book isn't horror. And in the end, I finally just say, no, it is, because I wrote it and I said so. So that, like, you're not going to find a higher authority on what this book is than me.
Because I said so. Right?
So,
but again, so as an author, right? So what, in your mind anyway, as you put words on a page and you're developing characters, plots, tension, world building. What do you consider, what are the elements within the story itself that in your mind kind of fall into that, this is horror rather than just suspenseful or a thriller? What sort of texture exists within your narrative that maybe doesn't in, let's just say, something that's a straight thriller, but is not horror?
For me, I feel like thrillers can be very situational. Like, this is the situation we are in that must be resolved. Where with me for horror, I feel like whatever situation that is, it has broader horrific implications, somehow existential, somehow systemic, something bigger than just the incident that we're viewing. Whereas when I'm watching a thriller, it's usually it's this plot line and then it resolves and then the thriller is over.
Right.
So whereas with horror, I feel like there's something that lingers. There's something bigger that's not going to be resolved.
Right. So maybe like a thriller, whether it has an actual ticking clock or not, it kind of does, because the event will end. And when the event ends, the thrill is over. But horror is something maybe that, if I'm hearing you right, kind of has more of a lingering sensation, a pervasiveness to it that even if the event is over, the impact remains. Is that sort of right?
For me, yeah.
Okay. How about
that's, but I mean, like I said, you're going to get different answer every time.
Right. Gwendolyn?
I consider so much horror. Like, I'm always the person who's like, I will take everything into horror. Like, I consider most suspense thriller to just be part of a broader horror genre. Like, I did something so petty this last week. I shouldn't even admit this on a panel. I blocked somebody I didn't know because they said that Silence of the Lambs wasn't horror. And I was just tired because I consider Silence of the Lambs totally horror. I never even block people on Facebook, but I was just in a mood that night. And this person was being like so smarmy about it. And I'm like, I'm done. I'm blocking you. Because it's like, there's a suit of women's skins. Like, and of course it was a dude. I'm like, it wasn't a suit of guy skins. Like, I bet then, Yandy, you'd consider it to be horror. And I was just done. And I blocked this person because, like, I can completely consider Silence of the Lambs.
Being trapped in the well, in the basement, if that's not horror, like, I'm not entirely clear what would be. I mean, what would you have to do? Fill it with acid or something?
Yeah, exactly. Like that part of it in particular. Like, if you want to say what's going on with Clarice and Hannibal isn't horror, I still consider that to be horror. Like, it's this very new FBI agent dealing with a serial killer. I still consider that horror. But even if you don't consider that part, that's just thriller to you. The basement, at the well, with the women getting ready to be skinned, it's horror. So yeah. Right. I was totally petty, and I can't believe I admitted that on a panel, because even after I did it, I'm like, man, that was really petty, Gwendolyn. You should
actually, I disagree. I don't think it's petty. I don't think it's petty. I think it's petty at all. I think what you did was, I think you cut off a jackass immediately. That's what I think. But that's just my opinion. What do I know?
We'll go with that.
All right. See, you have Russ's official stamp of approval. That's it. You're good to go. You see, and not only that, you've got the severed hand of approval. That's it. You're good. All right. So Dan, I feel
like a lot of horror gets rebranded because horror kind of has a stigma as a genre. So I feel like I think there are mysteries that are really horror books, but they call it a mystery because then mainstream will read it.
Hold on, that's interesting.
And I think it's a marketing ploy.
Yeah.
So that's interesting to me. Talk to me about that, about the stigma of horror.
Well, it's looked down on a lot as far as genres go, as being cheap thrills, as being something that's not, worthy as far as literature goes. So I think there are a lot of times you get a horror book that gets called something else completely, like mystery or thriller or, gothic. And it's really horror, but they want people to read it and not be embarrassed that they're reading it. So they call it something else. And it's just all publishing, marketing. Wow. I don't think it has anything to do with the contents of the book.
It's the eternal dance of horror or shame between publicists, agents, and authors. I mean, Russ, you were talking about that meter of like, tell me the elements, tell me this and that. And the reason I'm sort of poking fun at that is because I was going to chime in and say, well, the real answer to that is whatever the marketing department says it's going to be, and
Exactly.
you know, I feel bad. I'm with Gwendolyn and the gang that The Silence of the Lambs certainly is horror, but I could see, you know, the poor fool or the limited mind who perhaps there's a perception that, okay, someone might choose to limit themselves and say, well, horror has to have something supernatural in it, and they might exclude all the very effective, the human kinds or the crime thriller kinds of things. And there's so many different metrics that you could, or textures that you said, Russ, that you could just dial in to any one person's given definitions. And one of them, quite basically, could simply be atmosphere, you know, and whether or not there's any sort of crime, human horror, or supernatural, you know, especially this time of year, it's Halloween. One of those metrics is just the vibe and the atmosphere of it. You know, I submit, I think there are the great thing about horror is there are so many and they play so nicely, but yeah, it's a scale.
All right, so Dan, I'm gonna stick with you for a minute. So I think it's fair to say that to varying degrees over the last half dozen years, I would argue, including the pandemic, we've been living in an individual and collective horror show. In a world gone slightly mad, or maybe more than slightly, how does horror fiction stay relevant when so much of reality is frightening?
I think in doing what it does best, in providing escapism. And there are two edges to that sword. I think some people, you know, there was already you know, American Horror Story cult where, you know, dove into Trumpism, and they're already pandemic horror stories. So they could either just by veering right into the snowstorm, and also by continuing to just ignore it, to keep providing the kinds of escapism and stories that people want, because, you know, when things are mad, then storytelling and storytellers and art in general is ever more important. It's what we live for, you know, and what keeping our eye on the ball on the world that we want to fight for.
Gwendolyn?
You know, I think horror is always relevant because the world's always scary. And I like what Daniel said, that sometimes it's about leaning into that horror. And then sometimes it's about like kind of leaning away from it and looking at something that's a totally different kind of horror. Like I love Gothic horror a lot. And that's very different than I think a lot of the horror that we're living in now, though maybe not. You know, we were all stuck in houses, and people in Gothic are always stuck in old houses, right? So maybe that's totally relevant to us.
Right, but they didn't have Netflix.
Right? Like I thought that a lot over the course of the pandemic. We had just gotten like one of those digital TVs, and I already was like, wow, this is so cool. We can get all these movies. And if we hadn't had that during the pandemic, I feel like I would have been like in a Shirley Jackson novel where it was like, oh gosh, I'm like going slowly.
I mean, just imagine if the pandemic had happened pre-internet.
Yeah.
Or
well, I even heard people talk about like, what did they do in the like 1918 flu, 1970, 1918 flu? You know, they were all stuck in their houses, and it's like they didn't have nearly the entertainment. That's terrifying.
Yeah.
So I do think that, and again, like entertainment does offer this kind of a escapism. Yeah, somebody said they were also dealing with World War I. You know, there was a lot going on back then. That was a very scary time in general.
Sure was.
So
yeah. So Sarah, I don't read horror and I graze on it in my writing, although it's probably fair to say that some of my work falls under the genre of, you know, dark fiction, whatever that really means. I found that in general, horror fans are some of the more open-minded and welcoming readers that I've met. What's your take on horror fandom?
Well, this kind of ties into what we were just talking about too, is, you know, they've done a lot of studies that found that people who are exposed to horror in a comfortable way, like through media at young ages, develop those connections in their brain to better cope with horror in real life. And we form those neural pathways of dealing with anxiety and stress and horror. And I would agree, like I am a part of many different communities with libraries and pens and and books, and I gather a lot with different groups of people, but there is no one in the world as nice as horror people.
That's kind of been, you know, again, my interactions are limited, but just in my travels, when I meet them, whenever I meet them, they're so welcoming and interested, and they're like, oh, well, what do you got? What are you up to? Whereas in some other fandoms, it seems to be a lot more intense and bifurcated, but that's only because my experience is limited. Yeah.
Well, I think they're genuinely interested in people. And I think that is also because of that horror is empathy thing. Like we want to deeply understand people and how they're feeling. And that's one of our tools in our toolbox is just knowing people. And
so that's really interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about, just because I'm not exposed to it that much, the sense of empathy within kind of, let's say, horror fiction. And I don't know if it gets spoken about a lot in horror circles. I mean, does it? Because I just don't hear about it because I'm not around it that much.
It doesn't in my circles, but I don't know.
So, all right. So one question. So, Gwendolyn, comes to horror, do you prefer to read it or watch it?
I prefer both. I think it depends, you know, on what I'm into at that moment. Like I think that you can kind of get at a different type of thing, you know. I will say that if I really want to immerse myself more in a world, I will usually read it. But if I just kind of want to sit back and be like a little bit more passive, like unwind at the end of the day, I'm much more likely to watch it. Because I feel like it, you know, reading in general is a more active pursuit than watching something. You can do that and not really have to do anything. You know, you just kind of look up at it periodically, whereas reading is more intense, but then you also can go deeper into it most of the time, I think. So I think it really is like, all right, do I really want to get into something? And then I'll read it. If I'm like, I'm tired, I'm going to watch it.
All right, it's just a quick interlude for folks who came in a little late. If you have any questions or comments for me or the folks on the panel, put them in the chat box and we'll get to a few at the end. Okay, but that was great. But now it's time for the special segment of the show where we spin the wheel. On the wheel are 7 possible categories. Wherever it lands is what you get. And the categories are Freddy versus Jason, Stranger in a Strange Land, Truth or Scare, Trick or Treat, The Reanimator, Haunted House, and Straight to Hell. All right, you ready, Gwendolyn? Gwendolyn, you're up first. You ready?
Okay.
All right, what do we got? And you get Haunted House. All right, what do we got here? So a haunted house. Most of us have gone through a mock haunted house, but if there was an actual haunted house, ghost, demon, whatever, living in the space, would you spend the night even on a dare?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it would depend on what the story, like the story about the haunting was. Like maybe, like it would depend on that, but not on a dare. Like I would never do something on a dare, but no. I would probably say no even if I wanted to. Like I'm just that type of personality. Like, no, I'm not doing it on a dare. I thought you were gonna say for $1 million. And even then I'd be like, it would really depend. It would depend on what the story is. You know, like my husband and I always talk about the fact that we won't ever say Bloody Mary 3 times in a mirror, because I'm like, you know, best case scenario, nothing happens. Worst case scenario, what are you gonna do? Be like, oh, I'm sorry disturbing you, ghost. I'm gonna try to run away from this mirror now. Like it doesn't seem like there's any good like.
But no, why tempt fate, right?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, fair enough. All right, Dan, you're up next. You ready?
I'm ready.
All right, what do we got for you?
I'm thinking of that old Eddie Murphy skit on Haunted House. It's like, get out, honey. Sorry, we can't move into the house.
All right, Stranger in a Strange Land. Okay, so Dan, while you predominantly write horror, if you could write in any other genre that you haven't written in before, what would it be?
Well, when I first started out, I wanted to or thought I was a science fiction author. So while I've written some science fiction, what pops into mind is that's a genre that I like, especially making me think about Stranger in a Strange Land with the title of The Wheel of Spinning.
There you go. All right, fair enough. All right, Sarah, your turn. You ready?
Yep.
Let's see. You got, Truth or Scare. All right, this is a new one just for tonight. Okay, so Gwen, this comes in with your money Okay, you ready? So you have two choices. You're gonna pick truth, or you're gonna pick truth, or you're gonna pick scare.
Well, scare, of course.
All right. All right. Give me your best horror scream.
Oh gosh. Okay. Well, my children are trying to sleep. I don't want to. My 6-year-old is sick and sleeping, so I'm actually I'm not going to do it right now, but maybe later. Okay.
All right. Well, all right. So we'll give you a horror theme pass. So we'll switch you over to truth. Okay.
All right. That's fine.
Okay. So you ready? For $10 million, would you kiss a dead person on the mouth for 30 seconds?
Yes.
Wow. No hesitation. Yes. Okay.
I got bills to pay.
Okay. Well, I am very sad to say that I had such an experience once. Story for another day, but
wow,
it's not as it's not as glamorous as it sounds. All right. All right. Thanks, guys. So now we're going to go to our advice columns. We're all in the writing business to different degrees. So Gwendolyn, we're going to start with you. What's the best and worst writing advice someone ever gave you?
I think the worst writing advice is that a writer has to write every day. I think that that's just terrible advice. If that works for somebody, it's great, but you do not need to do that in order to be a writer. I think that's ridiculous and kind of unnecessarily elitist. So that's the worst advice. The best writing advice, just write what you want to read. I feel like I always go to that, but whatever it is you want to read in the world, write that story, because that's the story that you need to be telling.
All right. All right, Dan, you're up.
Wow, yeah, it's kind of a little hard to talk about this. I mean, someone once said, yeah, to be a writer, you have to write what you know, and therefore for $10, you must now kiss for 30 seconds on the lips this dead person. And I never really got over it. It was really bad advice. But yeah, 10 million sounds a lot better. Yeah, good. I mean, I think the best advice I once got was I guess what's coming to mind right now is separating the different kinds of advice that you're going to get. That, like, you know, there's so much advice out there, and so many people will throw it at you with authority, and just to be able to sort the different kinds of advice that, hey, this is the right advice for me, that works for me, and sorting the kind that, yeah, this might be good advice, but it's not for me, and then just sorting that batshit crazy advice and then leaving it on the floor like the stupid jokes that I just said there a minute ago.
Right. All right, Sarah.
I don't know. I mean, mine were kind of similar to Gwen's. So like the worst advice is definitely that write every day kind of thing. Like I can't write every day. What kind of life would you have that you can write every day? It's a charmed one, not so that's definitely one that really irritates me every time I see it. And the best writing advice, I don't know. I think a character first for me. Like I when I tell my writing students at the library when they're trying to plan a new story, you don't have plot if you don't have character, because that's where it all comes from. So.
All right, fair enough. All right, so we're going to take a couple of questions from the chat box. Let me see what we got here. Let's see, what do we got? There's one or two in here. Okay. The person who lives. Okay. Let's see. Here we go. All right, question for all. Was there a particular horror movie or book that kept you from getting a good night's sleep?
Probably a lot when I was a kid. I've been telling this story a lot this year for some reason, but The Fog when I was little. Like I was absolutely like terrified of it. And then that night when I was already terrified going to sleep. And then I woke up in the middle of the night and this really thick fog had come to my second story bedroom window and was just hovering there. So I just like screamed and screamed and screamed until my mom came running and she's like, it's not going to get you. But I was convinced that it was. So that definitely kept me from getting good night's sleep.
All right, Dan.
Wow, I can't think of one that like did the sleeplessness thing, but I'm just thinking about the kind of horror that I don't like, and or that just like gets to me. And as much as I love the movie The Descent. Just the fact of being in an enclosed space like that, or that sort of claustrophobia, probably freaks me out much more than like any of the monsters or beasties in the movie.
Okay, Sarah.
I would say House of Leaves got into my head pretty good. I was reading it in the middle of the night at my grandparents' house, and they had just moved into a new house, and it was the first time I'd ever been there. And I was pregnant at the time. And I got up to go to the bathroom, and I noticed a little door in a wall that I had never noticed before. And it might have been exhaustion, jet lag, pregnancy hormones. I don't know what was going on, but I was like, great, reality broke. It's broken. Like there's doors appearing in the wall.
There you go.
And it turns out it was just a plumbing access panel. So it had always been there. I just never noticed it. But in the middle of the night, after reading that book at like 3 o'clock in the morning, like that's when I noticed it.
Or maybe it's the kind of door when you open it, you see a plumbing access, but when you close it, the gremlins are really behind it. Maybe they're just sneaky like Maybe. All right. Yeah. So another question. What role, and now as I'm telling jokes, what role, if any, does humor play in horror?
I love humor in horror. I think it does a great job at breaking tension because like oftentimes in a movie or in a story, you can't keep that tension going continuously because the audience just fatigues and then you just are never able to, you can't keep it going. That's just not how the human mind usually works. It just becomes too much. So humor can actually break that tension and then allow you as a storyteller, to continue building it again. Plus, I think it can just give that kind of relief. It's almost like a chaser, right? After like taking a shot or whatever. Like it's something that like, it helps to kind of counteract it. And then you can go back into the horror. So I love things that are even just comedy horror that aren't even necessarily meant to be scary. I just think it's great.
So give me an example of, a movie, a book or something where humor is used effectively to break that tension.
Hammer movies did it some. They would have some random element of like horror, like humor, like just like kind of like somebody who would just like do something kind of odd or funny and then it would kind of come back to it. That was in some of the Dracula movies that you would have something that was kind of weird or whatever, and then you'd go back into building the tension. So I also think this is not necessarily, a lot of people don't consider him horror, but some of Shakespeare's stuff was really uncomfortable. And yet at the same time, like you look at something like Macbeth, which has lots of murder, lots of witchcraft. And then there's these weird asides where there's like these sudden, like, humorous things happening. And I never really realized until I saw Macbeth performed how it really does completely break the tension on the stage for this moment of like, okay, we're plotting all these murders and there's witches and there's all this stuff. There's blood she can't get off her hands. But then you have like this weird aside with humor and it does break that tension so you can go back into it and it gives that relief to the audience.
All right. So question for Sarah. What's the best horror movie you've seen since COVID?
Oh gosh. Well, like I said, I got young kids in the house and they don't sleep well. So I don't get to watch very much horror, unfortunately, because I want to fall asleep before they do sometimes. So I am woefully underwatched in my horror. But like the other night I rewatched Beetlejuice as one of my favorites.
Do you consider that horror?
Yeah, absolutely.
I do too. And that's actually a great example of comedy horror. Like it's a great comedy. Just a fantastic.
Yeah, Russ, you're about to get blocked here, Russ. I'm worried about you.
Uh-oh. That's it. I'm done. That's it. Wait. So we're Xing out. Good night, folks. Thanks. All right. This was great. We got a couple of minutes. So what I want to do is we're going to show some books. So let's see what we got here. Bear with me just 1 minute, and I'm going to share my screen, and we've got some stuff to share. All right, so we're going to do a little bit of this. I always screw this up, so bear with me. All right. Okay. Here we go. All right. Gwendolyn, talk to me. What do you got?
This is my latest novel, Bone, Set, and Feathers. It came out last year from Broken Eye Books. It's all about witches. It's about witches, witch hunts. It's a little bit fairy tale. Definitely got some horror in there. There's birds falling from the sky. There's bones that keep getting out of their graves. So it's definitely got a lot of horror elements. And so if you like weird fairy tales that are creepy, then this is the book for you.
All right, sounds good. All right, what else we got? Okay, Dan, what do we got?
Hey, this is my latest book. It's called Underworld Dreams. It's a collection of short stories, and they are all along the lines of if you like the Twilight Zone, you might tend to like these. They're full of stories that blur the line between the supernatural and the psychological, so where the supernatural elements, it's not ever clear if they're in play or if they are, what they are. And they're stories that tend to illuminate, heartbreaking stories about loss and the human condition, in addition to making you think and a little bit of scares and a little bit of uncertainty going on with it.
All right, fair enough. Okay, so what do we got? Sarah?
This is my novel, The Bone Weaver's Orchard. It's a gothic historical horror mystery. Takes place at a boarding school in 1926 in Yorkshire, England, where Charlie Winslow is having a hard time fitting into his new school when his only friend goes missing. And he decides that he doesn't believe the stories that students have just run away, and he's going to get to the bottom of where they're really going.
All right, that was great. All right, as for me, if you're up for a little sci-fi with your crime and mystery and a touch of horror, I'll encourage you to check out my sci-fi noir Fractured Lives, featuring my hard-boiled intergalactic private eye Angela Hardwick, part Doctor Who, part Blade Runner, and part Philip Marlowe. In Fractured Lives, Hardwick is hired to find out if a college freshman, who is also a galaxy design savant, is suffering from a nervous breakdown or is the victim of an urban legend known as the Scarlet Raj. Fractured Lives is available on Amazon and published by Crazy 8 Press. And if you want a signed copy, you can order it directly from me. All right, well, that was our show. I want to thank our guests. Thank you, Dan. It was so great to see you again. And Gwendolyn and Sarah for coming out today. And I want to thank everyone who's watching. Happy Halloween, everyone. And I'll see all you guys next week. Take care now.
Take care. Thanks for having us. Take care, Russ. Take care, Gwendolyn. Bye, Sarah.
Thank you so
all right.
much.
Thanks, guys. That was great. Take care. It was a great show. All right.